Okay, this is Joe Pullman, craftworking.net, and let's talk about storage. In the data center world, you've got two choices when it comes to storage. Again, you can have local storage, you can have shared storage. Shared storage is a SAN or a NAS that's connected via network to your host, and you basically either share out your files or you do block storage with iSCSI or Fiber Channel to store your virtual machines and your files on that device. So not going to talk too much about local storage because basically it's a hard drive in your host. The only thing about that is if you have clustered multiple hosts, you need to consider that you need to move these VMs from host to host, and therefore that the disk array or the disk drives have to be mirrored from one on each of the hosts or however hosts you have. So there are solutions out there to do this. Most of them are expensive and complicated. There is a solution from StarWin that's free for a small environment that can be considered. But today's topic is going to focus on shared storage. Now in shared storage, you've got three choices. You've got Fiber Channel, which includes Fiber Channel over Ethernet. You've got iSCSI, and you have NSF. So in virtualization, in doing a data center, I don't really like using network file services. Is basically a NAS, and what you're going to do is basically share out a file, and your VMs will be files, and it's a little bit harder to work with. What you want to normally do in an environment with a hypervisor is that you want to basically use block storage. So when you create a virtual machine, you're actually creating a disk and not a file. So I would really focus on using block storage, which is iSCSI. Block storage can be had with Fiber Channel, but Fiber Channel is, to put it bluntly, is just way too expensive. You have to have dedicated equipment, special NIC cards. All the switches and the networking has to be dedicated and specialized, and they're not cheap. They're very expensive. So the only real choice you have is iSCSI. iSCSI is very, very cheap. There's a lot of, it comes with your Linux distributions. You've also got free NAS, which is a Linux distribution dedicated for file systems and storage, and SANs and NASs. And what it will do, and you can set up iSCSI on it, and it's free. It's you just load it up on your SAN. It's small, and it's easy to use as well. The other thing about iSCSI is it uses your standard networking equipment. You don't need to go buy specialized switches and routers to basically transfer your file system. So it will use a regular off-the-shelf managed switch that you can get very cheaply. So, but now when it comes to dimensioning storage, since you're going to be spinning up a lot of VMs, a lot more than what you think you will, you want to buy a system that you can put a lot of hard drives in, or a lot of hard drive space in. So in my situation, I've actually have two SANs. One I built from parts and an old PC I had around, and I actually built it from just a desktop. And it's running an MSI motherboard. It's got 8 gig of RAM on it and an i3 processor. The one thing to consider when building a disk array is your RAID controller. This is going to be the heart of your entire disk system. You want to buy the best RAID controller possible. I'm personally like LSI. They're quite expensive. They can RAID controller, an 8-port SATA RAID controller can cost up $500–600 a piece, and that's just one add-on card. So for a regular, you buy a PC for let's say $500 or so, and you're going to spend another $500 on the LSI. But this is where you want to spend your money. Do not go cheap on your RAID controller. The hardware RAID controller will give you a little bit more options when it comes to the kind of RAID you're going to want to build. So if you want to start getting to really high availability and reliability, you want to go with a nested RAID like a 50 or a RAID 60. However, these get very expensive in disks, as the amount of disks you need to actually get enough storage to do what you want to do. So you can look that up on your own. It's definitely viable, but hardware RAID controller is a lot more, I think, in my opinion, is a lot more reliable than the software RAID controller. Basically, if something goes wrong with your motherboard and you've got software RAID on it, then you could be out of luck. So RAID controllers can be faster and more reliable. You have the ability to put backup batteries on them, so you can do don't lose your cache when you're doing reads and writes. So keep in mind. So in my system, like I say, I have a home built running an i3 processor. It's been serving me fine for 5 years now. I recently spent money on another box. Basically, it's a Supermicro. It's a 12 bay. And it's got a little bit more horsepower, 24 gig of RAM, and some Xeon processors, 5560s, I think. But again, it's got an LSI RAID controller on it, and it's running FreeNAS as well. So that went out the door. I think I spent $600 on. So it's another option. However, and when you're dealing with shared storage, you're going to buy another box. You're going to buy another server box, which is about the same size, if not larger, than your server that you just spent a lot of money on. So, but don't overlook the fact that you can actually get a PC, a desktop PC with enough bays in it to actually do a good job for you. So that brings me to the other point, is you need to look at how many drives you want to get. We have the hard drives up to 6 terabytes now, and you can build a very, very large array off of a relatively low number of disks. Right now, I'm running 6 disks, 3 terabytes each in a RAID 5, and it formats out to about 13 terabytes. I've got the same configuration on both of my SANs, so I've got a total of 30 terabytes. In shared storage with VMware, you have the ability to migrate your virtual machine's disks from one SAN to another. Also, it has the ability to do where you can automatically balance your disks space over several different SANs. So this is done automatically. So it's part of vMotion. So something else to consider. And that's basically it for RAID. Now, when it comes to iSCSI, you want to start looking at your network a little bit more closely, and you want to start considering some bandwidth. You do not want to run an iSCSI over 100 megabits per second network. You're going to need at least a gig. What I would do is bond them or lag them together, 2 of them. So when you put together a NAS or a SAN, put together some system with more than two NIC cards on it. So you're going to want 1 to manage, and probably 2, if not more, 1 gigs to basically to lag them together, to bond them together, so you get double the bandwidth. FreeNAS supports link aggregation protocol 802.3.AD or 1.AD, and It works great. iSCSI VMware supports that as well, so mine's set up that way. Now, also consider 10 gig is becoming very economical now. NIC cards for 10 gig can be under $300 a piece, including the SFPs that go into them. And you'll have to get two of these on to basically connect your host and your SAN, but that's an option, is to look at 10 gig. And this is what I've done. So I bought an Intel dual 10 gig card for the SAN, and each of the SANs actually. The same NIC card is on the host, and I'm actually running a bond LACP or LACP on that each SAN. So I've got 20 gig going to my SAN. So, and I didn't spend a lot of money doing it. Basically, I think $1,000, and I was doing 10 gig to the SAN. So something to consider. But that's about all I really have for the SAN. You can go, but do your research when you're putting together one of these things. And the other point to make is that when you're dealing with RAIDs and you build a disk array of whatever and you need to grow that, you run out of disk space. It's more easier to actually add another SAN than it is to actually try to grow the one you've got. It is possible. LSI can do it, and I've done it with limited success. But what you want to do is, if you're going to buy a SAN with, let's say, 12 bays in it, you want to populate the entire array with 12 hard drives. To grow a RAID is hit or miss at best. It can be successful, but if it goes wrong, you've destroyed your data on it. So anytime you're dealing with RAIDs, if you're going to grow a RAID, you have to back it up. One of the things I did, and because I've got the two SANs, is I can migrate virtual machines in my entire disk array from one SAN to the other one and do maintenance on it and then move it back. So it's something to consider for redundancy. Something that iSCSI gives you is that you can add SANs at will, and all you have to do is set up a simple iSCSI target, go into VMware, add a disk, and you're good to go. And it's actually fairly easy. So, but that's the basics of SAN. But again, do your research and put together the largest disk array that you can afford. The performance is basically based on RAID and your iSCSI. So, like say, the more bandwidth the better. I'm using 10 gig, and you will notice a difference between 10 gig and 1 gig, believe you me, because it's not so much the read and writes from the actual usage of the virtual machine, because usually there's not a lot of disk activity going on unless you're doing database. When you're dealing with normal usage, it all comes down to migrating these virtual machines from one host to another, one disk array to another, where you're copying the entire disk over. Basically, a 500 gigabyte hard drive virtual disk will take about 10 minutes to move on 10 gig, where it may take a couple of hours on 1 gig. So something to consider. If you can afford it, definitely go with the 10 gig. So, but that's all it for the basics of storage, and I will